Hello, and thank you for joining us for this session, Clinical Trials 101. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Clovis Oncology, for making this session possible. Clinical trials are a critical way to advance the science of ovarian cancer research, but they can also be intimidating. During this session, our speaker, Dr. Shannon Westin, will demystify clinical trials and discuss what's new. Dr. Westin is an associate professor of gynecologic oncology and reproductive medicine at MD Anderson Cancer Center. You can view her full bio in the downloadable conference program. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Westin, and I will now turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. I am Shannon Westin, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, and my focus is on early drug development and phase 1 trials within gynecologic oncology and reproductive medicine. And I'm so excited to be with you here at the OCRA virtual meeting. I'm sorry we can't be in person, but hopefully next year. I'm going to spend the next few minutes, 45 minutes around, to talk to you a little bit about clinical trials and what is involved with them and how to get involved. And I think it's going to be a really fun session. This is just my disclosures. Because I do early drug development, I work with quite a few companies, but none of them will be referenced today in this talk. So let's just do a little outline of what our objectives are going to be. First, we'll talk a little bit about the anatomy of a clinical trial. I'm a surgeon, so we got to talk some anatomy. We'll talk about all the different parts and what they mean and how we develop them. We'll talk a little bit about drug development process in general. How do these drugs get to you? How do they get into where you can utilize them for cancer, or where your loved one can use them? And then also I'll give you a little cruise through how we might find some trials. There's a couple of different sites that we can utilize, and I'll show you some snapshots about how you can do that. But the bottom line, the motto, if you will, the take-home message is that research is what cures cancer. And that research includes certainly what I utilize, which is the majority of what I do is treatment or therapeutic related, but we also have basic science and translational medicine where we try to understand why things work the way they do, and also screening and prevention. It's like, let's not even get cancer. Let's figure out how we can get that out of our mindset and instead prevent this cancer. So first, what's a clinical study? Well, this is Sir Bradford Hill back in 1962. He said, a clinical trial is defined as carefully and ethically designed experiment in humans with the aim of answering some precisely framed question. Okay, really? So what does that mean? Basically, a clinical study is going to be a research study that involves patients. It's going to be involving, it's not mice, it's not cells, it's not test tubes and petri dishes. We've got patients in front of us, and that's what we're doing with the study. It can be any improvement in healthcare. So that can mean screening, prevention. We're trying to improve outcomes. Okay. And typically, a lot of times by the time a trial gets to you, where you're able to potentially go on it or your loved one is able to go on it, it seems new, but in fact, it's usually at the long tail end of this long process that's gone on to try to get that drug to market. So for example, paclitaxel, which many of you may have received or your loved ones may have received. This was discovered back in 1967. That's the Pacific yew tree that they discovered paclitaxel from. And it started having clinical trials in the late 80s and then became a standard of care in the mid 90s. So you can see that progression of time that's involved. So when I write a clinical study, what am I doing? What am I putting into that? And how does that help you or your loved one? So it has a number of different components. Obviously, there's a title. That title is going to be as descriptive as possible. What are we doing? With who? When? So all of that information is going to be a part of the title, and it's also going to mention the investigators. Okay, this is being run by Dr. Westin, and these other doctors are involved as well. It'll have clear objectives. So we don't want to just say, well, let's try this and not know what it is we're looking to do. So we have to have goals. Are we trying to improve overall survival? Are we trying to see an improvement in response rate? What is the goal of the study? And that helps us make sure that when we design the study, we achieve our goals. Endpoints. So endpoints are the definition of the objectives. So if your objective is to improve survival, your endpoint will be what you're actually measuring. Are you measuring overall survival? Are you measuring progression-free survival? So again, giving very specific clarity around what we are looking for and what our goals are. The rationale. Now, we're not just doing this for fun, right? We're not just doing this because we have a hold of a drug and we are going to take the opportunity. We need to have a reason. We need to have a molecular understanding of a patient and her tumor and why these drugs will work or should work. And that's really where the rationale comes. We also have to have a reason for doing all the tests we're doing. So if we're asking you to get blood tests or we're asking you to get a biopsy, we need a rationale for that to make sure that we're doing what needs to be done and not doing too much. Eligibility criteria. This is where the rubber hits the road. Who's allowed to go on the study? And really, this is about safety a lot of the time. Like, we want to make sure we're picking the right patient, the type of tumor that needs to be treated, but also that someone's healthy enough and it's safe enough for them to go on. If we know our drug has an effect on the heart, we may want to, to not allow people with any heart disease on there because we don't want to hurt them. Study design, this is the details of exactly how many patients are going to go on and what are they going to be treated with and for how long and when are we going to check testing, and all of the cookbook basically that lets us run the study and keep you safe. And then finally, toxicity modifications. Now, this is part of our study design. So we know there may be side effects and we need to have, again, that cookbook, those instructions for, okay, this is what you need to do if you see this problem. This is what you need to do if we see this problem. And that just makes sure that we're taking care of you and allowing you to stay on hopefully a good regimen. And finally, the statistics. This is how our statistical colleagues make sure we get the answer we're looking for. So how many patients do we need to treat to be sure that this is actually having an impact on survival? And that really helps us make sure that we don't go through a long, big study and then only to find out, gosh, we didn't get an answer. That is not appropriate, and we use our statistics to avoid it. Where can you go on a clinical study? There's a number of places. You could come to a place like mine, to a large cancer center. You could go to a university hospital. But studies they're in every medical center and physician's office. There's actually a very large community-based practice that have clinical trials through ASCO. And so you basically can have evidence or find exposure to a clinical trial wherever you go. But sometimes certain trials you might have to travel for. Who pays for them? This is a really important question. And, there's a number of different funding groups that potentially could support a clinical trial. And, the largest in the United States is the National Cancer Institute. They fund quite a bit of studies through both cooperative groups such as NRG Oncology, as well as large grants. Like we here at MD Anderson have these grants called SPORES, which are specialized projects of research excellence. Pretty cool. Sounds nice. SPORE, maybe not the best name, but point is, got lots of money, and for a good reason, because we basically put together a plan and say, we're going to test this, we're going to do this, and all of that is supported by the NCI. But in addition to the government, other places we can also get funding from other places, such as industry. That's the drug companies that own the drugs. They will put money forth and help us design trials and hopefully get those trials to you. We can use foundations like the Foundation for Women's Cancer, the Ovarian Cancer Research Fund. They look at different proposals and they decide who they might give money to and why. And then our institution sometimes has funding. So sometimes we can seek out funding through our institution, say we've got this really great idea and we haven't been able to get a grant and industry's not quite excited yet about it, and we think it's really important. And so our institutions can sometimes help us with that as well. So let's go through a little bit of drug development now. I love this part, and you'll have to bear with me because I get so excited. We're going to basically go through what's the pathway of your drug to get FDA approval. So first we have an idea. I bet that this drug would work well in this set of patients. So first we do a bunch of what's called preclinical studies, mice, rats, test tubes, that kind of thing. We test to make sure, does this really work the way we think it does? Is there any side effects that we weren't expecting? Really making sure that we are keeping you safe and making sure we're not going in to patient studies until we've really well developed it. So we use it in those petri dishes, we use it in animal models, and then we move on to phase 1. Phase 1 are small studies that we're using to find what is the best dose, how high of a dose can we give of this drug, what are the side effects, making sure we know how to manage them, and making sure that it is safe for you. Now, phase 1 also looks at, is it working? So it's, if you're on a phase 1 trial and you're tolerating it well, that doesn't mean you'll stay on if the treatment isn't working for you. So we do consider things like efficacy. How well is it working for you? But the primary goal is that, determining the dose and understanding the side effects. Once we get a signal and we're excited about it, we move on to phase 2. Now, phase 2, they're a little bit bigger, and they start to ask more of the question, does this drug work for this cancer? And then if that is positive, then that drug will move on to phase 3. And this is an attempt to make a new standard of care. So these trials are often very large. They're randomized, meaning there's more than one arm. And you either get the old standard of care or this new treatment. And you're comparing to see, does one do better than the other? And understand if you can change the standard of care. And of course, these phase 1, 2, and 3 are the ones that are all in people. Now I wanted to get a little bit more granular with some of the other pieces we talked about. So endpoints, this is the clinical outcome. Remember, we talked about survival, response to therapy, but importantly, we also look at other things. Obviously, we want to see survival. We want to see people live longer, but we also want to see, does it help their symptoms? How much side effects does it cause? What are the adverse effects? Is there any drug-drug interaction between, if we're trying 2 or 3 new drugs together, is there any evidence that they interact in a bad way? And then how are these drugs metabolized? So there's all sorts of cool things we can look at from part of an endpoint. Now, this is a survival curve. This is the ultimate. This is what we want to see. So the way survival curves work is on the bottom line is time, okay? And on the y-axis, the up and down line, that's the estimate of how many people are alive or whatever your endpoint is at that time. So if this was a survival curve, it would be the proportion of patients alive at that given time. So you want to see people surviving for a really long time. And you compare the 2 curves. So the red curve is treatment A, and the yellow curve is treatment B. And you want to see a big gap there. That big gap tells you that treatment A is much better. People are living longer on treatment A when compared to treatment B. And we basically create something called, or calculate something called a hazard ratio that tells us how much benefit does that new drug offer over the standard of care. So let's talk in a little bit more detail about each of these pieces. So preclinical studies, this is where we're before patients, right? So those are the little petri dishes, and we use the drug to see if it kills the cancer cell in those little petri dishes. And then we say, okay, we're going to try it with the little mices, and then and only then it goes to you or to your loved one. Now, importantly, we don't just stop there. We often will do biopsies or blood draws when you're on a clinical study and use that to reinform. So if we see things changing in the tumor in response to therapy, we might go back and say, okay, this is a new combination that I need to explore. And this is just an example. So these are preclinical data from PARP inhibitors, which many of you may be familiar with, are very, very hot right now in ovarian cancer, and FDA approved a number of different places. And what we basically did was we looked at different types of cells, different petri dishes, and saw that these PARP inhibitors killed these types of cells. And we were really excited and were able to move that forward into humans. And so that's a phase 1. So phase 1, the goal again is toxicity. Usually they're a little smaller than some of the other studies. And we usually do it in cohorts. We enroll people in groups of 3 or 4, evaluate them, make sure they're doing okay, and then move on to enroll more patients. The eligibility is usually pretty open. It's not as tight as some of the later types of studies where it gets more and more strict. And usually there's tons of phase 1 studies that are done. Many of them never move on because they're not successful. And so you see a lot more of phase 1 trials as compared to others. Now, this is an example of a trial I did with a PARP inhibitor, olaparib, in combination with a different drug called AZD2014, which was targeting a really exciting pathway. And we thought the combination of the two would do better than either one alone. So this is the dose levels. And what that means is we'll treat 3 patients on dose 1. If all those patients do well, we move those doses up with the goal of trying to get to the kind of maximum dose we can and make sure that it's not too toxic. And the number of patients that ultimately go on that study depend on how many side effects we see. So in that trial, we saw some activity and we were very excited. And so then we go to move on to phase 2, a little bit larger. And really the goal again is efficacy. Does this work? Does it cause shrinkage of tumor? Is there survival benefit? Usually it's going to be a little larger, like 40 to 60 patients. And we can see either single arm studies where everyone gets the same treatment, or we can see randomized where we separate the two. Okay. We see quite a few of these trials as well. A lot of drugs get to phase 2. And this is an example of a randomized phase 2 study. This is a really important study called Study 19 that took patients after their response to a chemotherapy and randomized them to either getting olaparib maintenance, a PARP inhibitor maintenance, or placebo. And the objective was to determine progression-free survival, how long they stayed on the study without their tumor growing. And it found, here's our survival curve. So we know it's good because there's space between the treatment arm, olaparib, and the placebo. So patients on the olaparib lived longer without progressive disease. Pretty cool. And that and subsequent studies led to olaparib's approval in this patient population. So pretty awesome. But it didn't get approval until they did a phase 3. Remember, that's the definitive larger study that's going to really compare this to the standard of care. It's going to randomize between new and standard, usually about, anywhere from 200 to 1,500 patients, depending on the amount of difference they're looking for. And it is going to be tighter. It's going to be much more restricted as far as who's allowed on, and their existing side effects, their existing toxicities. And you can see the number of these trials is a lot less than what we saw for phase 1 and phase 2. And this is an example of a randomized phase 3 trial. This is the NOVA study in, again, recurrent maintenance. So patients had recurrent ovarian cancer and had response to their platinum-based therapy, and then were randomized to either the niraparib PARP inhibitor or a placebo. And that primary endpoint was progression-free survival. And here's some more survival curves because I know you guys love them. You learned about them and now you're ready. You want to use your knowledge. So this is a really impressive survival curve. I'm happy if I can get my thumb in there. You could drive a truck through this one. So niraparib had a clear benefit for progression-free survival, for how long someone lived without their tumor growing, especially in patients that had a germline BRCA mutation. Now the next few curves are a little bit different. So we still see a benefit. This is of niraparib over placebo. But interestingly, if you look in the non-BRCA mutant, so in patients that didn't have a mutation, it's good, it works well, but it doesn't work as well as it does for germline. So that's important information. It means anyone can get it. This is FDA approved for everyone, but it helps you understand if you're going on this regimen, what's your likelihood of benefit and what's the magnitude of that benefit going to be. This is another example of a randomized phase 3 study. This study was called Aurelia. This was in recurrent and ovarian cancer that was considered platinum resistant. So their tumor had grown through a platinum therapy or grown right after. And they were randomized to either getting a non-platinum therapy, and they included paclitaxel, topotecan, or pegylated liposomal doxorubicin. And then they were randomized to either that or that chemotherapy plus bevacizumab, which is a drug that targets bad blood vessels. And they were again looking at progression-free survival, a very popular and common endpoint. And you tell me, is this good? I wish I could see your nods because I know you know that this is a nice curve. You see that difference in that treatment arm with the bevacizumab compared to the standard of care arm of chemotherapy alone. And so this achieved an FDA approval because it helped extend people's life without progression. And importantly, their quality of life was better too. So really exciting to see, to be able to put forth a new combination. And not only, sometimes we worry, you're adding another drug, are you going to get too much toxicity? No, not too much toxicity. And importantly, they felt better. And so that's really exciting. So let's just summarize, like, what are some of the benefits that we see with a clinical study? Well, we get access to new drugs and interventions earlier. Sometimes you won't be able to get these drugs until they're FDA approved. And so if you participate in a study, if you're excited about that drug, you get access to it earlier. We definitely do very close monitoring. It's extremely standardized. As I mentioned, we've got the cookbook that we're following. And so often you'll have more visits. Some people might not want that, but we do watch very closely because we want to make sure we know what the drug is doing and how well it's working. It helps you have an active role in your healthcare. You're going to be very involved in the decision making around this, and people tend to like having that kind of, I'm taking control of what I can control. If it's a good drug, you'll be among the first to benefit. All those women that we just looked at that were on those clinical trials, they were the first ones to get that beneficial drug, and that's really exciting, and is a great honor of being on a clinical study. And it may be better than what you could get as standard of care. You should always ask your doctor, well, do we think this is going to be better? Now, we won't know because that's the purpose of the trial, but you want to make sure you know what is your chance of benefit from kind of the standard option that you would get off of a trial? And then what's your potential benefit from participating in this study? That should be well documented and well explained to you before you decide to go on. Negatives, there's more logistics usually. Sometimes you have to travel for the study. Sometimes you have to have extra tests or extra biopsies. And, it can be burdensome. We definitely, when we're developing these studies, we try not to add too much extra to your plate. I know many of my studies, I actually vet with advocates who are patients that have either been on studies or been treated in general and give me their opinion. That's too much, Westin, or no, I think that's reasonable. So we try to keep it from being too burdensome, but it definitely can be an issue. There may be unknown side effects that you're not expecting, that the investigator's not expecting. And so, I think we try to vet these drugs as much as we can, and we try to set your expectations as much as we can. But sometimes there can be side effects we weren't expecting. And so obviously we'll have to handle those as they come. And then, of course, the converse of what we just said in the benefit, the new approach may not work. Despite the best science and the right selection and all the things that we do to try to make sure that we put you on the right trial, it may not work for you. And so that definitely could be a negative, especially when you've gone through as much as you have on the study. So let's talk about this. I've got an example of this. So this was a study called GOG 182. It was a very elaborate study. It was for patients with advanced stage, newly diagnosed ovarian cancer. There were 5 different treatment arms. Okay. The standard of care was paclitaxel and carboplatin. Then they added gemcitabine to it. They also did an arm with paclitaxel and carboplatin and added pegylated liposomal doxorubicin to it. And then they did 2 arms where they did one combination and then and then changed to a different. So you got topotecan and carboplatin, followed by paclitaxel and carboplatin. So it was a very large study. A lot of patients went on, thousands of patients went on. And unfortunately, it didn't show a difference. These colors aren't all that different, but I think you and I both can see there's no pinky getting in there. You can't even get a fingernail between those 5 curves. And so obviously a question was answered here. More is not better. Different is not necessarily better than the standard of care. But obviously, that's a lot of patients to get that answer. So we do our best to try to design trials where we're thinking we're definitely going to get a good answer. But sometimes, despite our best efforts, we get the curves laying on top of each other. And this is just the overall survival. So it didn't really benefit people and keeping their cancer away, and it didn't benefit them from overall survival. So how can we, how are you protected? This is a really important slide because it shows all the different things that are done to make sure that you're safe. So anytime you participate in a clinical study, it's voluntary. And frankly, you can withdraw at any time. So if you agree to do a study and then say, you know what, I don't want to do it anymore, that is your right. Okay? And you can't be forced to go on a trial. So if you came to see me in clinic, I can't just give you a trial option. I will give you multiple options and say, these are the different things that are in front of you on the buffet table, and which one do you want to do? The clinical trial is going to be monitored by its sponsor, which is the funding source, and that will be explained to you. So you will know who's going to get your data, who's going to see this information. You will understand the purpose of the study. When you're deciding to go on, that will be very well spelled out for you. You'll understand exactly what the experimental intervention is, as well as the standard of care, and how long do you have to be on this study. And they'll also explain to you how you can withdraw, meaning I just want to get out, I don't want to do it anymore, or maybe you're having too much side effects and you need to come off, or it's not working for you, your tumor's not shrinking, and in that case you'll withdraw for that reason. They talk about the benefits, direct benefits to you as well as to the benefit to society as a whole. Obviously, there's a degree of altruism that is involved in clinical studies because your data and your effort will go on to potentially change care of other people, which is kind of cool. They talk about risks and alternatives, right? So again, you're going to get a buffet. You're not going to just be, this is the only study, this is what you have to go on, this study. They'll talk about any costs to you. Typically, a lot of trials are covered by the sponsor, covered by either the industry or by the government or whoever's running the trial. But sometimes there's standard of care costs that your insurance may be required to pay. And so they'll make sure you understand that. Compensation, we try not to do that because we don't want anything that could be construed as coercing you to go on the study, but sometimes travel costs will be covered, things like that. There are multiple measures to preserve privacy and confidentiality, so those will be described to you. And there will be a plan to disclose new information. So say you were on this trial for 6 months and someone had a really bad side effect, that will be passed on to you. And then, another way we try to protect you is by monitoring your safety. We're always checking, is it working? How are you feeling? Are you having too many side effects? Now there is a reality check. I get very dewy-eyed and happy and excited about research, but sometimes, it's not all roses. So, certainly barriers to progress are as follows. We can see that research and development, it costs a lot of money. And a lot of money is invested into these drugs, and sometimes they don't go all the way to market, and it's waste. It's hard to keep up. We know funding is going down. The government has different priorities sometimes than cancer research, and so it can be hard to get this research funded. Certainly there's a lot of nervousness around clinical trial participation. There hasn't always been a great history, especially with people of color that were taken advantage of. And so really making sure people understand what the benefit is for participation, and also that your doctor understands why you might consider a trial versus a standard of care. And it can be kind of a downer. There's so many trials done and there's a lot more negative than positive. We do our best to design these trials the best way we can, but they're not always successful. And that can be hard to kind of keep that positive attitude. And of course, sometimes we have positive trials and then they don't get used. So you get a good trial that has a positive outcome, and then it's not necessarily incorporated into clinical practice. And so I think those are all things that can really hold us back. And then in ovarian cancer in general, the biology of this cancer is so complex that, it's not one target's not enough and one chemo is not enough. And so we're really learning how each of these interact with each other to be able to create the best combination therapy. But because we've worked so hard and we've gone through this 10-year process and really tried to vet these drugs, it gives us a lot of faith. We feel like, okay, once we get to this point, we know we can trust that this drug is going to help you. And you can trust saying, okay, I'm ready to go on this. And so it's a long vetting process, but it's achieved some type of acceptable benchmark that helps us feel like this is safe and effective and you should use it. And I put a little snapshot here of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network recommendations, because these are constantly being updated, and anybody that's taking care of you can reference them and look and say, okay, in this setting, these are the acceptable options based on these studies. So it really does give us a really great resource. So when do you do a clinical study? When should you participate? Well, it used to be people didn't really do clinical studies until well into their cancer diagnosis. Now, I mean, obviously, if we can get it before and do a prevention study, that's amazing. You can also get it when you're first diagnosed, and this could involve a new surgery option or new chemo or targeted therapies. And it may be a modification of what we're already doing. So we're doing this, but we're going to add this. And so there's a number of new diagnosis trials that are available. We also see a lot of participation in clinical trials when the cancer comes back. So we define these studies based on the amount of time it's been since you received your platinum. So you might have platinum sensitive disease or platinum resistant, and that helps guide which of these types of trials you should go on. And these often include new agents or combinations of new agents, or, drugs that are FDA approved in another cancer type that we're going to try here in ovarian cancer. So we know it's safe for people, but what we want to know is, does it work for you? And then we also, there's definitely an option to participate kind of later in the disease continuum when conventional treatments have failed. And this is often where we're looking at phase 1 studies. I will say that, in the past, like I mentioned before, and I just reiterate this, it used to be that you went to a phase 1 when there was no other option. And that's really changing, because now the phase 1s are so targeted that you could get access to a drug that's tailored to your tumor well before you want to go on a chemotherapy that maybe has a 2% chance of working for you. That's obviously too low. And if it's the only option we have, that's fine. But sometimes these trials have more exciting potential, and that may be when you want to go on it. And this is just my little sciencey snapshot to just talk a little bit about kind of why these new therapeutics work. So this is a little snapshot talking about some of the things that make a normal cell abnormal. So what happens? You get an environmental exposure, you get some genetic exposure, and then that cell starts to undergo uncontrolled growth. Then it begins to invade, and then it metastasizes to other cells. It also can kind of co-opt or draw in new blood vessels and support itself. And all of these different parts, the uncontrolled growth, the invasion, the new blood vessels, can all be targeted by different novel therapeutics. And so that's what's so exciting about these new drugs and what they might have. Versus chemotherapy really just attacks the rapidly dividing, the uncontrolled growth piece. The targeted therapies give a lot more options for therapy. So, and I forgot I have this cute little fly-in. So you can see these therapeutic opportunities really occur at all these nodes along this process. I wanted to mention immunotherapy just because it's a super hot topic. It is something that we're really excited about. It's been really great in a lot of other cancers, not ovarian cancer just yet, but we are working to figure out how it might work best for patients with ovarian cancer. And the drugs that are kind of the farthest along are what are called checkpoint blockade, immune checkpoint blockade. And so if you think of it like this is the next slide, you can see these little guys that are sitting on your cells, and they're brakes on your immune cells, meaning like car brakes. And so we can actually block the brakes so that your immune cells get revved up. And the goal is that they fight the cancer. Works really well in some types of cancers like melanoma, lung cancer. Still working it out in ovarian cancer, and likely instead of just using one set of brake removers, we may do step on the gas and take the brakes off at the same time. So there's a lot of research ongoing with immunotherapy, but it's not yet kind of hit prime time with ovarian cancer. Moving forward, we're trying to be more selective. We're trying to say, instead of just treating every patient the same, we've got to use, what does the tumor look like under the microscope? That's histology. We have to understand, what's your tumor using to be a cancer? Why is it successful? Can we look at the pathways that are allowing it to do that? Use something called genomics to say, okay, your cancer has this abnormality. We're going to use this drug. And we're really trying to use biomarkers, which are tests, either in the tumor or in imaging or in blood, that really help us understand who is going to benefit from what treatment, and also identify when there is not benefit, move on. Let's get on to something else that has a better chance of working better. And we are trying to work on new directions to really control toxicity. So learning about new supportive care measures, starting new pharmacology agents to fight the adverse events that we might see. So that's where things are going. So I'm just going to take the last, like 10 minutes to review how you can find a clinical trial. There's a number of really cool websites, and I'm going to go through 2 of them. And I'm going to show you kind of what they look like and how you might use them. Your other resource is your physician. Your physician hopefully can tell you what trials they have at their institution or where you could go to get one. Check out your local cancer center. Check out MD Anderson. We have a website. You can get in touch with us and find out if there's a trial for you. So this is clinicaltrials.gov. This is kind of this tried and true. This is run by the National Cancer Institute. It's run by the government. We're required, any clinical trial that's being done in the United States is required to be listed. We have to get a special number, and that way they can monitor how it's going and progress. And so we've got a number, over 500, I just did this yesterday, 500 different trials, first phase 1, 2, and 3 ongoing in ovarian cancer. Now, obviously that can be super overwhelming. You're like, Shannon, how do I know which of these trials? So let's take you through. So this is when you go onto the website, this is what you'll see, clinicaltrials.gov, and it'll say find a study. And I have a little box there for you. And you'll basically click in there and add what you're doing. And so I think, yeah. So here oops. Let me go back. There we go. We can put in ovarian cancer and then move forward and see what we get. So we typed in ovarian cancer and we got, oh my gosh, the slide's so tiny, I can't even see, but it's like almost 3,000 studies. Okay, that's too many, right? We can't go through 3,000 studies and understand which one might be good for us, right? So how can we get a better idea of what might be an option for us? Well, we could modify our search. So let's do that. That's this little click box here. So when we hit modify search, it's going to pull up options. And you can see there's lots of different ways you can refine your search. Obviously, you've got your cancer type. You can put that you want it to be interventional. You can click that you want it to be actually enrolling. And down lower, you can pick what type of phase it is. So here's where you would do, kind of a little bit more detail, like, okay, I want an interventional study. I want something that's still enrolling. And it'll let you kind of search down that criteria and reduce that number of trials. And here's where you can potentially put in, well, I'm not interested in a phase 0. I'd rather just do a phase 1, a phase 2, or a phase 3. And so you can give that extra information. Now we're down to like 540. Okay, that's still a lot, but it's a little bit more manageable. But what if you kind of have a better idea of a specific trial you're interested in? So we can go back, start over, and say, okay, not only do I want to look for studies that are for ovarian cancer, I also want to look for specifically studies that include a PARP inhibitor, because that's the drug I'm kind of excited about, and my doctor told me I should get that. Okay, now we're under 100. That's, a little bit better, but you can see how you can keep adding things and understand what options might be there for you. Now, let's say we're looking here. We said, okay, here's some PARP inhibitor drugs. Well, this trial looks very interesting. MD Anderson. I met that Shannon Westin. She gave me a talk on clinical trials. What is this study that she's doing? So you can see this study is recruiting in green. It has some of the things that they're allowing for. You can see just a quick snapshot of who they're looking to put on the study. You can see the drugs. They're looking at the PARP inhibitor niraparib with a drug called capanlacib. It's a PI3 kinase inhibitor. And you can see that it's located at MD Anderson. So you can click on that and it brings up a front page where you can see a little bit more detail. And I didn't have room on the slide, but you can scroll through. It has everything. It has specifics about the intervention, specifics about the study in general, more details around the eligibility and that kind of criteria. So it's a really nice resource and helps you kind of find it. Now, what if you're wondering like, well, where is it? Where can I go? Do I have to go to MD Anderson? You can click on locations. And so you can see, okay, here is where, here's where I could potentially go, and it'll often have contacts for that. So here's the snapshot for this. So here I am. Call me. There's my number. No, please don't call me. But this is, if you're interested in this trial, I will take your call. And you can come and see, okay, well, this one's just at MD Anderson. Now, for some studies, you'll see that it is at a number of different places, like 60 different places. And then you can try to contact the person at the location that's closest to you. Now, the Foundation for Women's Cancer also has developed a really nice clinical trial search. Now, this is, if you haven't been on the Foundation for Women Cancer website, it's a great website. It's lots of education. It's a great group, not unlike the OCRA. And they have a little clinical trial search. So if you hit this clinical trial button, it'll bring down this drop down that shows clinical trial basics and find a clinical trial. Now, you don't need to look at clinical trial basics because you just learned it all. No, but in all seriousness, they have some really great information there that will basically support what we've talked about today and provide that detail again if you're interested in reading what you just heard about on the lecture. But if you're wanting to get a clinical trial, you're going to click that Find a Clinical Trial box. And similarly, it'll take you through a series of things. So here first, it has a landing page where it says, okay, this is where you can find trials, and this is some information, and it's run by this company that that they have working. And they also have some other places to go to look for trials. But if you're ready to find your trial, you're going to click here on that gold box, and that brings up this trial navigation service. So it's a little similar but different to what we just saw in the clinicaltrials.gov. Okay, so it's kind of cool. You can, and this is throughout this website, it has request a contact. It does make it very easy for you to click and say you want somebody to call you to give you information about what you might be eligible for. But it lets you kind of view trials too. So you can go through a find your match, which is interesting. Like, you put in details about yourself as much as you're willing, and they may say, okay, here you go. These things you might qualify. Or you can say, I just want to look myself, and I'm just going to view some trials. And so you can click here and say, okay, I want cancer treatment for adults. They also have for children. And I want ovarian cancer. And if you want to get really granular, you can even put, I want this to be near my zip code. And they'll tell you if there's something closer to home. And then you click on view list, and you get a list. Okay. And it gives you a lot. So there's a lot of information. But again, you can see some basics about the trial. What's the name of the trial? What's the intervention? Who might you contact and where? Okay. And what I thought was really, and so this is, you could either click either the trial itself to get details, or you can request a contact. So you can basically click and have someone call you. It's a research navigator that'll help you kind of go through this process, which I think is really nice and really helpful for patients. And this is just what the details of the specific study will show. And basically, it'll show you, again, the name of the study and some basics. This is a phase 3 study, and these are the interventions. And again, there's that button. You can get screened right then and there. You can put some information in to pre-screen yourself so you're not wasting your time. Or you can, that's right, request a contact. And so see that someone from that trial will call you and say, okay, you might or may not be eligible. So a really neat service offered by the Foundation for Women's Cancer. So with that, I would just say thank you all so much for your attention. I hope that you've had your questions answered about clinical trials. This is the way we move things forward, and often can be one of the better options for you in your therapy or your loved one. So I'm so happy that I got to be here today, and I do look forward to next year where hopefully we can all be in person again. You take care. Be safe.